The ruins smell like rust and Douglas fir needles. I'm standing in what used to be a Forest Service fire lookout station, built sometime in the 1940s and abandoned 30 years later when aerial surveillance made these remote outposts obsolete. The wooden stairs collapsed decades ago. The windows are empty frames. Moss grows thick on the metal roof and saplings push through cracks in the concrete foundation. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm a wildlife photographer, though lately I've been thinking of myself as more of a documentarian of abandonment. Human structures returning to forest, civilization's slow surrender to entropy and root systems. I've been hiking the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in southern Washington for 2 weeks, documenting these forgotten places, old logging camps, collapsed bridges, the skeletal remains of a 1950s resort that promised wilderness luxury and delivered bankruptcy instead. This lookout is the furthest I've pushed into the backcountry, 18 miles from the nearest maintained trail. No cell service for 3 days. I thought I was alone here. Then I saw the tracks leading into the ruin, and the massive shape sitting in what used to be the observation room, looking at something I couldn't see, waiting maybe, for someone to finally listen. I've always been drawn to places where nature is reclaiming human ambition. It started when I was 12, exploring the abandoned steel mill outside Pittsburgh where my grandfather had worked for 30 years. The buildings were slowly collapsing, metal oxidizing into lace patterns, trees growing through the roof of the foundry. My grandfather told me the mill had employed 3,000 people at its peak. Now it employed pigeons and wild grapevines. Everything we build, he'd said, is just borrowing space for a while. That stuck with me. After college, environmental science degree I wasn't using, I bought professional camera equipment and started traveling, documenting Rust Belt towns, abandoned theme parks, ghost towns in the desert. The aesthetic was popular online. Urban exploration, people called it, though I preferred to think of it as witnessing the negotiation between human intention and natural law. Gifford-Pinchot had always interested me because of its history. Named after the first chief of the United States Forest Service, the forest had been heavily logged from the 1880s through the 1960s. Entire mountains stripped bare, rivers choked with sawdust. Then gradually, through regulation and replanting and simple abandonment, the forest returned, but evidence remained, if you knew where to look. I'd spent the first week photographing old logging roads being consumed by alder and salal, a rusted steam donkey. The engine used to drag logs, sitting in a creek bed like a mechanical fossil, railroad grades that had once carried millions of board feet of timber, now serving as deer trails. The fire lookout appeared on a 1953 USGS map I'd found in a university archive, decommissioned in 1972. Officially, it should have been dismantled, but budget cuts and remote location meant it was simply locked up and forgotten. I'd spent 3 days hiking to reach it, following old Forest Service roads that degraded from gravel to dirt to barely visible traces through second-growth forest. When I finally arrived, the structure was more intact than I'd expected. 2 stories, built on a rocky outcropping that provided 360-degree views of the surrounding mountains. The metal exterior stairs had collapsed, but the building itself stood, tilting slightly eastward but fundamentally sound. I'd planned to camp nearby, photograph the structure in different light conditions, then continue deeper into the forest toward an abandoned CCC camp from the 1930s. But when I circled the building, looking for the best angle, I found the door, not the main door. That was 12 feet off the ground, accessible only by the collapsed stairs. This was a ground-level access hatch, probably for maintenance or storage. The metal door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and it was open. Fresh scratches in the rust, disturbed dirt in front of the threshold. Something had gone inside. I stood there for 10 minutes, weighing options. The photographer in me wanted to investigate. The part of me that had survived 2 weeks alone in wilderness by being careful said to leave it alone. Curiosity won. It usually does. I pulled out my flashlight, checked my bear spray was accessible, and approached the opening. The smell hit me first, earthy, musky, with an undertone of something else. Not decay, exactly. More like the smell of an animal den, concentrated and organic. I shone the light inside. A concrete floor, surprisingly clean. Metal shelving units, mostly empty. Stairs leading up to the main observation level, and massive footprints in the dust leading upward. I'd read about Bigfoot sightings in this region. You can't spend time in Pacific Northwest forests without encountering the lore. Gas stations sell bumper stickers. Tourist shops hawk plaster cast footprints. The Sasquatch is simultaneously joke and sincere belief, cultural icon and cryptid depending on who's talking. I'd always filed it under folklore, interesting culturally, unlikely biologically. But standing there, looking at footprints 17 inches long pressed into concrete dust, I had to revise my categories. The prints led up the interior stairs, deliberate, evenly spaced. Whatever made them had climbed confidently in near total darkness. I should have left. Photographed the exterior, hiked back to my camp 2 miles away, processed what I was seeing with distance and daylight. Instead, I started climbing. The interior was surprisingly intact. Some water damage, extensive rust, but the structure had been built to withstand mountain winters and it showed. The stairs were steel, bolted to the walls, still solid despite decades of abandonment. I climbed slowly, flashlight sweeping ahead, trying to breathe quietly enough to hear any movement above. The observation room occupied the entire second floor, a square space with windows on all 4 sides, most of the glass long gone. The original firefinder equipment had been removed, but the metal table it had sat on remained, bolted to the floor, and sitting on that floor, back against the northern wall, knees drawn up in an almost human posture of contemplation, was something I'd never seen before and couldn't quite process. 9 feet tall, even seated, covered in dark brown hair that lightened to gray around the face and shoulders, broad chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths, hands, impossibly large but proportioned like human hands, resting on its knees. It was looking out the western window at the mountains beyond. It knew I was there. I could tell by the slight angle of its head, the tension in its shoulders, but it didn't turn. We stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds. Me frozen on the top stair, flashlight probably shaking in my hand, though I don't remember. It sitting, breathing, watching the mountains. Then it spoke without turning around. The voice was deep, resonant, with harmonics that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Not quite human, not quite animal, something between or beyond. "You come to photograph the endings," it said. Perfect English, though the cadence was strange, too measured, like someone speaking a learned language with great care. "You find them beautiful." I couldn't respond, my throat had closed. "I understand," it continued. "I have watched many endings. This place," a gesture with one massive hand toward the ruins around us, "is small ending. Practice. Rehearsal." It turned then, slowly, to look at me directly. The face was not an ape's face. The structure was different, flatter, broader, but with eyes that held something I recognized. Intelligence, sadness, the weight of too much knowledge. "You want to know if I am real?" it said. Statement, not question. I managed to nod. "I am real. My people are real. We have been here longer than your buildings, longer than your maps. We were here when your ancestors crossed the ice. We were here when they ended the world the first time." My brain struggled with that sentence. "What?" "Sit," it said, gesturing to the floor. "If you want to understand, sit. I will tell you what your history has forgotten." I sat, not because I'd made a conscious decision, but because my legs stopped supporting me. I lowered myself to the dusty floor, back against the wall opposite the creature, flashlight between us casting shadows that made the space feel even more unreal. "My people have longer memory than yours," it began. "We do not write. We do not build stone monuments. But we remember. Each generation carries the stories forward, unchanged, unembellished. What I tell you has been told exactly this way for 12,000 years. 12,000 years. The number hung in the air. When your people came to this land," it continued, "the world was different, colder, wetter. The ice still covered the northern mountains and the land was full." It gestured outward, toward the forest beyond the broken windows, full of giants, mammoths that could knock down trees, sloths taller than you, cats with teeth like knives, camels, horses, dire wolves. The land shook with their walking. The herds moved like brown rivers across the grass. I knew this from paleontology, the Pleistocene megafauna, but knowing it academically was different from hearing it described this way, not as extinct species but as lived experience. Your ancestors were few, hungry, smart. They had fire and sharp stones, and most dangerous thing, they had cooperation. They hunted together, planned together, killed things much larger than themselves. The creature shifted, the movement causing the floor to creak softly. At first, the killing was balanced. They took what they needed. The herds remained. But then something changed. Maybe the climate, maybe just human nature. The killing became easier, became habit, became sport. Its voice carried no judgment, just stating facts with the same weight you'd give to describing weather. Over 2,000 years, your ancestors ended 70% of the large animals on this continent. The mammoths, gone. The giant sloths, gone. The horses, the camels, the great cats, gone. The world became emptier, quieter, smaller. I wanted to argue, to cite competing theories, climate change, disease, comet impacts, but I stayed silent. My people watched this, it continued. We were smaller then, weaker. We survived by hiding, by moving at night, by staying in the deepest forests where humans did not go. We watched the giants fall. We watched the prairies empty. We watched humans celebrate their victory over nature. It paused, looking out the window again, and then we watched them starve. When the great herds were gone, many human groups failed. Populations crashed. Entire cultures disappeared. They had ended their world, not completely but enough to learn. For a while, the creature turned back to me. Your people rebuilt, learned to farm, learned to take only what the land could give. For thousands of years there was balance again. Not perfect, but stable. And we thought perhaps that lesson had been learned. Its eyes held mine. But now we watch you cut the old trees, dam the rivers, fill the air with poison, hunt the last animals, build structures like this, a gesture to the ruins around us, then abandon them when they are no longer useful. We watch you repeat the pattern. My voice cracked. I cleared my throat. We're trying, conservation efforts, environmental protection. We're not, you are doing exactly what you did before. It interrupted gently, only faster, more efficient, more thorough. This time, when you end your world, you will take everything with you, including us. We sat in silence for several minutes. The afternoon light slanted through the broken windows, illuminating dust motes that hung in the air like suspended snow. Finally, I found my voice. Why are you telling me this? The creature made a sound, soft, almost like a sigh. Because you photograph the endings, because you see the beauty in collapse, because perhaps you might also see the warning. But I gestured helplessly. I'm just one person. I take pictures, post them online. I'm not a scientist or a policymaker or... You tell stories, it said. Stories matter. Stories are how change begins, how memory persists. I thought about my Instagram feed, 15,000 followers who liked moody photos of abandoned places, who commented with emojis and variations of nature always wins and everything returns to dust. What do you want me to do? I asked. What you already do, it replied. Show the endings, but also show why they happened. Connect the ruins to the pattern, make people see. And if they don't listen, if they don't care, the creature shifted its weight, and I heard its joints crack, a sound disturbingly human. Then my people will watch your world end, as we watched the mammoth fall, as we watch the forest burn and the rivers dry. We will survive, perhaps. We are good at hiding, at enduring, but something will be lost. Not just your civilization, not just your technologies, but the possibility of what you could have become. I pulled out my camera, moving slowly, showing it clearly. May I? It regarded the camera for a long moment, then nodded, a gesture borrowed from human language. I took 3 photos. The creature in the ruins, backlit by western light. The profile against the broken window. The massive hands, scarred and weathered, resting on ancient concrete. These photos, I said. If I share them, if people believe they're real, they'll come looking. For you, for your people. It could make everything worse. Yes, it agreed. This is always the problem with truth. It has consequences. I lowered the camera. Then what? You must decide, it said simply. Proof that brings invasion, or story that brings understanding. Both are risks. Both could fail. But story has more wisdom in it. Story allows people to choose what they believe. I thought about that. The difference between evidence and narrative, between proving something existed and explaining why it mattered. Tell them about the mammoths, the creature continued. Tell them about the patterns. Tell them you saw ruins in the forest and understood finally that every ending was once someone's beginning, that every abandoned place was once someone's hope. And if I mention you, mention us as you wish. as legend, as metaphor, as dream you had in the forest. The specific truth of my existence is less important than the general truth of the pattern. It stood then, the movement fluid despite its size, and moved toward the southern window, looked out at the forest below. There is an old logging camp, it said, 6 miles southeast, more ruins. The forest has almost reclaimed it, but traces remain. Clear-cut slope above it from 1955. New growth struggling in poisoned soil. Good photographs there, good story. You know the forest, I said. Not a question. We know every inch of it. Every ruin, every grave, every place where humans tried to make permanent what was always temporary. It turned back to me one last time. Make your choice, Marcus Webb. Truth or story, proof or wisdom. But make it understanding this. Either way, you carry weight now. The weight of having seen, having heard, having been trusted with knowledge. The creature left through the main door, simply pushed it open despite the rust and the angle, dropped the 12 feet to the ground with a flex of its legs that absorbed the impact impossibly well, and walked into the forest without looking back. I stayed in the ruins until sunset. The photos on my camera were clear, unambiguous. A large bipedal creature, covered in hair, distinctly non-human. They would cause a sensation if I posted them. News coverage, scientists demanding access to the location, cryptozoologists descending like a swarm, trophy hunters, reality TV crews. This forest, currently home to maybe a dozen hikers per year in this sector, would be invaded, and the creature's people, however many remained scattered through these mountains, would be found, studied, contained, protected maybe in the way we protect endangered species, by putting them in ever-shrinking reserves, managing their populations, turning them into scientific curiosities and tourist attractions. I thought about the mammoths, about 70% of species lost in 2,000 years, about patterns repeating. I reviewed the photos one more time, then I did something that would have horrified me a month earlier. I deleted them, not because I doubted what I'd seen, not because I thought people wouldn't believe them, but because I'd been given a choice and I understood finally what the choice really meant. Proof would satisfy curiosity but solve nothing. The creature would become specimen, data point, controversy. The focus would shift to, does it exist, rather than, what does its existence mean? Story, though. Story could carry the weight differently. I could write about finding ruins in the forest, about understanding, while sitting in that abandoned fire lookout, the cycle of human expansion and retreat, about evidence of Pleistocene extinctions visible in the archaeological record, about the clear-cut slopes still visible 70 years later, trees growing stunted in chemically damaged soil. I could mention, almost as a side, the legend of watchers in the forest, beings that remembered, that observed, that waited to see if humans would learn this time. Let people wonder if I'd actually seen something or if it was metaphor. Let them debate. Let them decide for themselves what to believe. The important part wasn't the creature's existence. The important part was the pattern it had described, the warning it had offered. As darkness filled the observation room, I made detailed notes in my field journal, not describing the creature, that felt like betrayal now, but recording what it had told me, the timeline of extinctions, the correlation between human arrival and megafauna collapse, the cautionary parallel to current environmental patterns. I would research this, verify it against paleontological data, talk to scientists who studied late Pleistocene extinctions, and I would tell a story about ruins and memory, about patterns and choices, about the watchers in the forest who remember what we've chosen to forget. Before I left the lookout, I did one thing more. I took my knife and carved carefully into the wooden window frame, in letters small enough that only someone looking closely would see. They are still here. They are still watching. What will we choose this time? Not evidence, not proof, just a question, left in a ruin, for whoever found it next. I hiked out over the next 3 days, stopping at the logging camp the creature had mentioned. It was exactly as described, 6 miles southeast, almost completely reclaimed by forest. The main structures had collapsed decades ago, leaving only concrete foundation pads and rusted equipment too heavy to remove. A tracked skidder, wheels seized, frame covered in moss, steel cables thick as my arm, coiled and corroding, and above the camp, the clear-cut slope. 70 years after the logging, you could still see the impact. The original old-growth forest, Douglas fir, western red cedar, trees that had been 500 years old when they were cut, was gone. The replacement forest was different, thinner, younger, less diverse. Red alder and big-leaf maple, fast-growing pioneer species. The soil still showed signs of compaction from heavy machinery. Nature was healing, yes, but slowly, incompletely. I documented everything, photographed the ruins from multiple angles, took soil samples, not because I knew what to do with them, but because it felt important to gather evidence, measured the diameter of new growth trees and compared them mentally to the old stumps, some 10 feet across, that remained like tombstones throughout the forest. This would be the core of my story. Not the creature, but this, the visible evidence of human impact, still legible decades later, the pattern made physical. On my last night in the forest, I made camp near a stream and wrote the first draft of my essay. It began with the fire lookout, described the climb, the ruins, the weight of abandonment, then transitioned to the logging camp, the clear-cut slope, the mathematics of forest recovery measured in centuries. I wrote about the Pleistocene extinctions, about arriving humans and vanishing megafauna, about the debate among scientists regarding causes, climate change, disease, or hunting, and the growing consensus that humans were at least partially responsible. I wrote about patterns, how humans tend to expand until resources collapse, then contract, then repeat the cycle, how we're uniquely good at forgetting our own history. And I wrote about the legend of the Watchers, beings who existed at the margins of human awareness, who survived by remaining hidden, who supposedly remembered what we'd forgotten, the empty prairies, the silenced forests, the world before we arrived and simplified it. I didn't claim to have seen anything. I presented it as mythology, as local folklore, as metaphor that contained truth regardless of literal existence. The essay ended with a question: what if the Watchers are real? And what if they're waiting to see if we'll repeat the pattern or finally break it? When I returned to civilization, real civilization with cell service and Wi-Fi and the constant hum of human activity, I spent 2 weeks refining the piece. I researched exhaustively, interviewed paleontologists about late Pleistocene extinctions, talked to forest ecologists about recovery timelines after logging, consulted with indigenous historians about traditional stories of forest beings and environmental stewardship. The essay grew to 8,000 words, academic in its research, personal in its narrative, careful in its claims. I submitted it to a long-form environmental journalism site. They accepted it within a week. It published on a Tuesday morning in September. Within 48 hours, it had been shared 15,000 times. Within a week, it appeared in several major environmental newsletters. A podcast wanted to interview me. A documentary filmmaker reached out about developing it into a longer piece. People responded to the story, not because they necessarily believed in the Watchers, but because the pattern resonated. The ruins, the extinctions, the question of whether we could change course. But there were other responses too, ones I hadn't anticipated. 3 weeks after publication, I received the first email. Subject line: "I've seen them too." The sender was a wildlife biologist in British Columbia. She described an encounter while tracking caribou populations. A massive figure at the edge of her thermal imaging, moving on 2 legs, gone when she looked directly. She hadn't reported it officially, hadn't told colleagues, but my essay made her feel less alone in her uncertainty. More emails followed. A forest ranger in Oregon, a hunting guide in Montana who'd found tracks he couldn't explain, a mushroom forager who'd encountered something in the Mount Hood wilderness and spent 3 years trying to rationalize it away. None of them had proof. All of them had doubts. All of them felt relief at being able to discuss it in the framework I'd provided, not as cryptozoological proof, but as encounter with something that existed at the margins of understanding. But there were other emails too. Cryptozoology enthusiasts wanting exact coordinates, trophy hunters offering money for location information, a reality TV production company proposing to film me returning to the site. I declined everything, gave no specific locations, emphasized that the story was about patterns, not creatures. Some people understood. Others accused me of hoaxing, of clickbait, of exploiting indigenous stories for personal gain. I read every response and answered nothing. Then 2 months after publication, I received a package. No return address. Postmarked from a tiny town in southern Washington, less than 30 miles from where I'd been hiking. Inside, a small wooden box, hand-carved from cedar, and inside that, 3 objects. A stone, smooth and river-worn, with what looked like a deliberately carved spiral on one side, a tuft of dark hair, coarse and thick, and a piece of paper with a single sentence written in handwriting that looked almost human but somehow wasn't quite. The letters slightly too uniform, too carefully formed. You chose well. The story continues. I sat at my kitchen table holding these objects, feeling the weight of them in ways that had nothing to do with mass. This was acknowledgement, confirmation, trust, and responsibility. I put the objects back in the box, put the box in my safe, and I continued the work, not chasing proof, not seeking another encounter, but telling stories about ruins and patterns and choices. I documented more abandoned places, more clear cuts and collapsed structures and forests slowly reclaiming human ambition, always with the same underlying question: what will we choose this time? The essay led to a book contract, then speaking engagements at universities and conservation organizations. Each time I told the story the same way, beginning with ruins, ending with questions, leaving space for listeners to draw their own conclusions. Some people believed I'd actually encountered something in those mountains. Others thought it was literary device. Most fell somewhere in between, willing to entertain possibility while focusing on the larger point. And that was fine. That was exactly the ambiguity the creature had suggested, because the specific truth of its existence mattered less than the general truth of what it represented. Memory longer than ours, perspective wider than ours, witness to patterns we keep repeating. 5 years later, I'm back in Gifford Pinchot National Forest. Different season, spring instead of autumn, but same territory. I've hiked these mountains a dozen times since that first encounter, always staying alert, always watching for signs. I've never seen the creature again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if I experienced some kind of psychological break in the isolation, creating elaborate meaning from ambiguous stimuli. The photos I deleted exist now only in memory, and memory is unreliable. But the box is real. The objects inside it are real. The handwritten note is real. And the pattern the creature described, that's real too, documented across thousands of scientific papers about Pleistocene extinctions and current biodiversity collapse. Whether the messenger existed or not, the message remains. The fire lookout is still standing 5 years later, more weathered, leaning a few degrees further east, but fundamentally unchanged. I climb in through the same ground-level hatch, ascend the same stairs. The observation room is empty now, just dust and rust and afternoon light through broken windows. But my carved message remains on the window frame, letters darkened with age. They are still here. They are still watching. What will we choose this time? I sit in the same spot where I sat 5 years ago, back against the wall, looking out at mountains that have witnessed countless human endings and beginnings. The book did well. The speaking tour reaches thousands of people annually. The essay has been translated into 14 languages and taught in environmental studies courses. Some things have changed because of it. Small things, local things. A proposed logging operation in critical habitat got canceled after community pressure. 3 indigenous-led conservation initiatives received funding, partially because the essay raised awareness. Students email me saying they changed their majors to environmental science after reading it. Small victories, incremental progress. Is it enough? Will it matter in the larger pattern? I don't know, but I think about what the creature said. Stories matter. Stories are how change begins. As I'm preparing to leave the lookout, I notice something new. 3 stones arranged in a line on the rusted metal table. River smooth, deliberately placed. My heart rate increases. I approach slowly, as if sudden movement might make them disappear. Beside the stones, a message scratched into the rust. Recent, the metal underneath still bright. Still watching, still hoping. Thank you for choosing story over proof. I stand there for a long time, reading and rereading those words. Then I pull out my current camera, newer, better than the one from 5 years ago, and I photograph the message. But I don't photograph it for publication, for proof, for social media. I photograph it for myself, to remember, to hold on to the knowledge that somewhere in these mountains, beings older than our civilization are watching our choices. Hoping we'll break the pattern this time, hoping we'll become worthy of the world we've inherited. Some ruins are warnings, some memories are gifts, some watchers see further than we can imagine, and some choices, the hardest ones, mean knowing when to stay silent, when to speak, and how to carry the weight of both.